Welcome back, Sean.
It's good to be here. Another sunny day.
Another sunny day. I know you bring the weather with you every time.
Try to.
Yes, it's greatly appreciated. Thank you very much.
Take the weather with you wherever you go.
Crowded house, isn't it? Love it. So how are you?
I'm really well. Really well. I'm excited to be here today to talk specifically about internal family systems.
Yes.
And to talk about it, as an approach, but also generally in terms of a metaphor.
Yes.
Because it seems to me, working with clients, it's what I try to do is find the best metaphor for them, the metaphor that's going to work best for them.
The one that holds the meaning for them, isn't it?
Yeah, that holds the meaning, and it's my responsibility to sort of join with them in their metaphor rather than asking them to join with me in my metaphor of psychology or psychotherapy, kind of, because it says it should be that way. And when we start talking about internal family systems, that's what we'll find is that Richard Schwartz, kind of started out by just applying the principles of systems thinking and family therapy to individuals. And then with incredible humility realized that it was an imposition, and then started to listen to the clients and their own experiences, and their parts began to speak back to him, and that's really how he developed the approach. So I do often, and it's something that I say again and again, I do think that therapy is part of the problem, in the way that we have I was in Bristol yesterday going around the RWA, the Royal West of England Academy, and looking at an exhibition there and looking at art, and some paintings you look at and you just know that they're a painting. You look at it and it's art because it fits so neatly into what is deemed to be art. And when I make something, when I draw something, when I write something, I kind of want people to look at it and question, is that art? And and I've often had that response to the work that I've done, which has always there's always been a strong response when people have looked at the work that I've done. Some very heated, some have a strong response in terms of it has quite a strong, it sort of activates something in them.
Yeah. I've always been curious about how people experience art in different ways. Like somebody can create a piece of art in any format, not necessarily a drawing or a painting, any form of art. And somebody else can take a different meaning from it. And I've always found that so curious and so interesting to me.
It's great, isn't it? And I think that is furthered when it has this looseness, and it might not fit so easily within what we expect it to be. And I think children's art, children's drawings, is a beautiful example of this. There's such spontaneity, and the size and the shape and the colour of things, they make it whatever shape they want, they make it whatever size they want, and the limbs are stuck on at different angles, and whereas as a person sort of moves through, again back to this sort of educational system, but moves through and then studies different schools of art and different ways of making art, then their work becomes more like a work of art, rather than a record of a process that the person's been through.
Something in my head is ringing with embodiment around that process. It's almost like that process of being involved in art, of creating art, is a sense of embodiment as well. And that's kind of what makes a sense of authenticity about it. Do you know what I mean? When you get a sense of looking at, like you said, a painting, and you know it fits into art. Some other art I look at and I get more of a sense of it being real.
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
and authentic.
Yeah.
And I think we pick up on that, you know.
Definitely.
It's that capturing a moment in time, which when I was recording music was like a minor obsession of mine. I never used to like track recording, so I never used to like lay the drums down, lay the bass down, then put the guitars on, then the vocals. You know, I never used to like doing that. I was like, right, let's do it live. Let's do one take. You guys playing live, because you're capturing a moment in time where you're all interconnected, and that comes across to the listener when you listen to the music.
That's it, and I think that is exactly what for me determines the quality of a work of art, the quality of a piece of music, the quality of dance or theatre, and also the quality of therapy. You know, that it's that moment in time. It's live.
Yes.
You know, so a therapy that prioritizes a procedure or, you know, a prescriptive way of working or understanding or interpretation. And I was reading in a book the other day by a wonderful book called Unruly Therapeutic by Faluk Taylor. And she said, fear is material, but it is not material for interpretation.
Think about that for a minute. Fear is material, but it's not material for interpretation. Yeah. So that's a great sentence.
Yeah.
Isn't it?
So fear is very real. It's very visceral. It's present in our body. We feel it. Very quickly, we're encouraged to move on to interpret it, to explain it, to tame it, to analyze it. And that's why I prefer approaches such as existentialism and Gestalt, which prioritize description over analysis. And I think it's the same with art and the same with everything. And why I value that approach over interpretation and analysis is the embodiment, because essentially I think all therapy is a means of returning us to a sense of connection that we've been separated from for the past 400 plus years. You know, from the Enlightenment we were talking about last time through to the present day, and the sort of, you know, the increasing sense of certainty that comes with materialism and modernism has brought wonderful advances to medicine, to science, to our understanding of ourselves and of the world, but it has at the expense of a connection that I believe is fundamental to us all.
My God, yes.
And so all therapy, it seems to me, regardless of the approach, especially given the sort of relational corporeal turn of the sort of past 50 years, is a means of returning us to a sense of connection, a sense of awe, a sense of spirituality. And
I like that you said that word, and this is a word that crops up a lot, and crops up a lot more these days. I think it's a word that until recently was pretty much misunderstood.
Yeah.
I think when you said the word spirituality, certainly when I was growing up, myself and a lot of my peers would make that connection with religion straight away. And as I've grown older, I've realised that those two couldn't be more separate if you tried, you know. And I think a sense of spirituality is, for me, to define spirituality as connection with self.
Yeah.
You know, and when we talk about connection, I think having a sense of connection, that connection with self is the first one. Once you have that, then you automatically have a connection to others. And my brain immediately goes Jungian with this and starts talking about collective unconscious, and, you know, because I love that Jungian theory of collective unconscious.
Yeah.
You know, I think it's great. And I've just realised your headphones aren't turned up, so I'm just going to adjust that.
Okay.
I don't think you've got any volume in your headphones?
No, but I can hear myself speak. I can now hear myself.
If I give you a little bit more, can you hear me?
That's good. I can hear you
Okay,
too.
lovely.
Yeah.
No worries. I just noticed that out of the corner of my eye. I was like, oh, I better give you some volume then.
Yeah.
So self and connection with self. That's where we were at with that, isn't it?
Yeah. and so that's where I think whatever therapeutic approach, whatever philosophy that we're talking about, we need to hold it loosely, because it's a means to that connection, not something which I don't want any theory or learning to stand as an obstacle between me and that connection.
Yes.
You know, the whole purpose of it is to regain that connection. So when I was a child and playing with plasticine and drawing and making marks, I had that connection. When I moved, I had that connection. But as I moved up through school, then I realized that I needed to be focusing upon other things and learning abstract concepts and principles. So it moved away from a phenomenological relationship with the world that is implicitly spiritual, because spirit, I think, connects us to ourself. It is the connection to self, and it is the connection to the world. And yes, you know, that principle can be institutionalized, and so you get organized religions, which are, I think, wonderful for people. There's a fantastic sense of affiliation in a community, in a congregation, and to some extent I miss that. I miss the church, and I miss the sense of belonging. And
there is a sense of belonging about being in a group of people with a similar view.
Yeah.
You know, there is a real sense of power in that, I think.
There is, and I think that's why a lot of people find themselves attracted to different groups, different approaches, you know, ecology and the environment, and even conspiracy theory, I think, is a bonding, a very, very strong bonding between people towards a sense of certainty and a way of managing the uncertainty, you know? Because
I think that one comes first. You know, the need to manage the uncertainty comes first in the order of priority there, doesn't it? You know, which is, I think, why people go down those rabbit holes.
Yeah,
you know.
yeah, because we're constantly asked, or we ask ourselves, what's happening here?
Yeah.
You know, and that's the interpretation. And but the staying with the description in terms of, so if my response to what's happening here is to describe what's happening, to find a metaphor for what's happening, then I think that is healing. So approaches like clean language and symbolic modeling and IFS and but all therapeutic approaches are actually metaphors. But I was saying to students the other day, we're actually in the metaphor business. You know, that's what we're in.
Who was it who said that it doesn't matter what counselling modality you use, because all you're essentially doing is providing your client with a framework with which to hang their emotions on? It's a beautiful quote, and I can't remember where it came from, but that is exactly it. So it doesn't matter whether you're going to see someone who's psychodynamic or someone who's Gestalt or Jungian or an analyst or a humanist or whatever.
No.
It doesn't matter. What matters, I think, is the framework that speaks to the client.
That's it.
You know, and the relationship with your counsellor, obviously you have to be comfortable with the person you're sat opposite, but then also the way in which you want to work has to fit with that counsellor. You know.
Yeah. And the dialogue that develops between you, where the meaning is created and doesn't exist in the head of either person, but in the space between.
Yes.
And so, you know, Schwartz was really sort of attracted to the work of Pearls because of that. Pearls was, you know, a bit of a maverick, a bit of a rule breaker, and prepared to be actively engaged and involved in the work that he was doing with other people.
Good.
I mean, yeah.
Good. I mean, all of that stuff was born out of the humanist movement anyway, wasn't it? You know, if you take it back. Which I find quite interesting, you know, that's where it comes from, because it still comes from that sense of the client being the one in charge, the client being the one in control, and the one who is the expert.
Yeah.
You know, and that is for me, certainly is a fundamental of how I work. You know, that's a cornerstone of my practice. But I love things like IFS because it highlights that, and it really does put the client in charge, in ownership. You know, and working with a client and seeing them come to kind of a conclusion of what their parts look like for them, what kind of characters they develop as, and how they see them.
Yeah.
You know, there's nothing more personal in the therapy room than working with something like that, because the client is in full ownership of all of that information.
Yeah, because those parts belong to the client.
Yeah,
You
absolutely.
know, and that's what Schwartz recognized once he really started to listen. Then clients were talking about parts, and they were talking about cycling through different parts in the process towards eating or not eating, or whatever it, you know, presentation it was, whether it was an eating disorder or addiction or something else. And but also it was, you know, I can understand how difficult it was, because at the time that might have been thought of as multiple personality disorder, or, you know.
That's something that's come up in the therapy room with me with clients before. I don't know if you've experienced that, but, you know, when I've started talking about different parts of the self, clients, am I schizophrenic? You know, or are you encouraging me to talk to the voices in my head?
Well,
you know, which my answer is always yes, I am encouraging you to talk, and no, you're not schizophrenic.
No,
you know, we all have this. You know, it's just a way of understanding the self. That's all it is. It's just a different way of understanding self.
Yeah, and I think a much more respectful way of understanding self than the sort of diagnosis of schizophrenia, which is a phenomenon. It does exist, but in terms of the category of the diagnosis and how that came about, and the harm that's been done, I think, but through that sort of diagnosis. And so it's not a term that I like to use, but I do like to gather the stories of the person who, because the experience is very real. I'm not denying that, you know. But if we prioritize the word, the signifier, the category, then we can sort of get. That's the obstacle I was talking about earlier between me and the connection.
Yes.
So me and the connection with the client is it seems, you know, really respectful what Schwartz came up with. But at the same time, you know, I think it again highlights just how much the therapy was itself an obstacle at the time, because, you know, the multiple personality disorder, people were encouraged to have a self that developed over time and was consistent, and certainly didn't have sub-selves and multiple selves or dissociative identity disorder. And so I think when people start to work with the practitioner, and the practitioner encourages them to say more about the self, to sort of represent the self. If that self was here in the room, what form would that self take? Sometimes that's in human form, sometimes it's in other form. I work with a client who, for them, that part was a ball of blue hands in the corner that was about sort of 12 foot in diameter, and the hands were all moving, and the ball itself was moving round. It was really quite. Now, there's no way that I could have anticipated that, but for them it made real sense. And in working with the part, we were able to, and this is what they wanted, still the movement and quieten the hands and reduce the size so it wasn't so overwhelming and frightening. But yeah, so...
But for you, that was up to you to understand what was going on there with that client. You know, that wasn't for the client to bring that into a framework that Sean works with.
No.
Do you know what I mean? That's the difference there, isn't it? You know,
Yeah.
you're not saying, right, okay, this is my framework, this is how it works. You're going, right, well, how do you experience this?
Yeah.
What does this look like for you? What does this feel like for you? What do you notice about it? All of these kind of questions are just eking out of the client, like, what's the experience of you and the relationship between you and this part like? Because this is, for me, where the analysis side of therapy comes in, because then that information goes into my brain and I'm working that out. What kind of part are we dealing with here? What type of protector is this? What's the exile that it might be protecting? You know, is it a caretaker? Is it a firefighter? Is it, you know, what are we working with? And then I'm able to bring that back in and work with that with the client, you know, and that's when it becomes interesting, because then you get the two-way street going on, you know, and that's when the work starts to happen. It's
Very
great.
much so, and it's very immediate. You know, I think it really sort of. I have always thought that therapy can happen in a single session. You know, before I discovered single session therapy of Windy Dryden and others.
I'm glad you brought that up, because I was talking to Sue Marnie about that last night, and I was going to ask you for the book, because she was interested in that, really interested in that.
Yeah,
So,
and Capturing the Moment is a really good book. It's catalogues, it talks from different authors, so different authors are contributing to it, and but Dryden's work, and you know, Dryden's book on single session therapy is really good. And because it's sitting with another person and recognizing that the arrogance of assuming that I can know them better than they know themselves, and that their experience is then filtered through some kind of structure and process which makes sense to me, that if with a little bit of psychoeducation will make sense to them. So, you know, when I'm working with clients and I'm working with parts, then I'm actually sort of, I might not necessarily use the terminology of IFS, so
No.
it just seamlessly moves into, so if that part was here, what form would that part take? What I do, and this is what we were touching on last time, was I want to encourage the person to experience what in IFS terms is called the self. And that was because a client said, well, no, I'm not, that this isn't a part, this is me, this is myself. And when I'm able to ask the part to just step back a little, then I can experience myself in a different way, which is not fused with one of the parts or enmeshed, a word coming from the work of Salvador Minuchin and family therapy. So
it's a lovely word, isn't it?
Enmeshed. It's wonderful, isn't it?
Yeah,
It really. I think,
you're doing that with your hands, and that was
Yeah.
what was going on in my head. It's like a sense of drawing together and kind of, what's the word I'm looking for? Words aren't with me today because I've had about 4 hours sleep. It's like a sense of belonging is almost what I want to say. Do you know, it's like a bringing together and a belonging all in one word.
I think that's the hope, and I think that's the unconscious intent is to belong, but enmeshment is a kind of loss of self in order to belong. It seems to me, you know, that
like the fall of ego in some way is what came to me then.
Yeah, because I think that, you know, in enmeshment, it's almost like I become blended with the other person, and I enter their part at the expense of myself.
That makes perfect sense. Yeah.
So something I do with clients is I ask them to write on a piece of paper, on a piece of A4 or something like that, you know, a name for the issue or whatever it is that we want to, that they're struggling with. And then I'll ask them, where in the room would you like to put that? And so they will then put that on the floor, and then we move away from that, and I ask them, what is it like to have just this, for these few moments, to have this little bit of space now between you and that issue? And that's my way that I have found in immediately helping somebody to gain a little bit of separate and step into self. And then from that self, we can look with curiosity and care and compassion at the part and understand the part better and open a dialogue with the part. I sometimes then, we will move towards the part to feel what it's like to sort of to blend again with that part, how that affects them physiologically, how it affects their breathing, their blood pressure, their thought processes, their emotional state, and then to walk back. And I'll ask them to tell me when you step into the part.
Yes.
So there's then a boundary. And then I say, can you tell me when you step out of the part and you step into the self that's over here, this observing part. So that then helps them to gain a little bit of differentiation from the part that they're struggling with.
Yeah, and it also gets away from this idea of stillness in therapy as well.
Yeah.
Of being still and in the room. We hit on this last time, and offering the client to change chairs and move positions in the room and sit on the floor if you want, and all this kind of stuff. It's that idea of getting away from you sit there and I sit here and then we have a conversation. And I don't even play this is my seat thing,
No.
Every session is, where would you like to sit?
Yeah.
And give the option. And some clients are a bit like, huh?
Yeah.
I can choose what
Yeah.
And I love that because it's immediately an invitation for the client to take control of the session. So you walk through the door, right, room's yours, what do you want to do?
Yeah. Yeah, and because that then furthers the connection, and that's really what I want to do, is I want to establish that connection. And so sometimes I'll ask the person to stand on the piece of paper, and at times when the person just feels sort of like so connected with the part, then I'll ask them to take the piece of paper that they have written on and just scrunch it like that, loosely like that, and then put it down there.
I can imagine the looks you get from clients when you're inviting them to do stuff
every time they've done this, and then I ask them to just simply move their arms, and they can feel it. When you breathe, you can hear the paper moving back and forth. When you refer to yourself, in myself, there it is all the time. You move around, you're conscious of it. I'm drawn back to it. But then I ask them to sort of reach in and take that out, to open it up and put it down there. Now when now when you move, it's not there. It's literally not there. It's there.
Yeah.
And that is in
there's
space
a real
of
power to that unblending. Generally, unblending like that, because it's a physical act. I really wish I could remember the name of the guy whose workshop I did up in Stroud, but he talked about fear in that way and unblending from fear, and that was a really good one. And that's actually why the anxiety cat is sat up on the shelf there, because I did a little short with Alan before we did our skydive. And it was all about unblending anxiety away from yourself. So we call the cat anxiety, and you hold it right up to your face. And I say, right, can you tell me what that is? No, I've no idea. Okay, but this is what it's like when anxiety is completely blended with you, when it's so close. It blocks all of your vision, it's taken everything over. Right, so now I want you to repeat a mantra, which is, anxiety is not all of me, it's just a part of me. And every time you repeat that, it moves a little further away. It moves a little further away until it gets to there. And I said to him, so now what is it? And he said, oh, well, it's a cat. And I said, well, there you go, mate. You realise when you get anxiety that far away, that anxiety is just a pussy.
Wow.
And you just make it into something ridiculous and funny, and it's a great way of minimising and unblending and all in one go. But he taught me that, and actually the group of people he did the workshop with, I will find out who he was because I'd love to have him on as a guest. But he taught me that and taught me that technique of unblending in that way. And I already had the IFS stuff on board from you and learning that at college. So I put the two and two together and kind of adjusted it into that little thing for anxiety. You know,
that is so good, so good. Anything you can make a bit of theatre out of.
Absolutely, yeah.
Anything that involves a doing takes us into and opens the connection with the unconscious. You know, and Jung knew about this in his work on the active unconscious and encouraging the active unconscious. So sort of like discovering and encountering parts of ourselves through the sort of what feels like an automatic response or a symbol that we reach out to, and that is so powerful that I can't see anything. You know, I can't see this and I can't see anything else, but getting some distance from it, then
it's the same thing as you with the pieces of paper and moving away, and it is the power of almost kind of embodying that sense of it being a part of you. You know, and then actually stepping out of that and realizing the difference between when that part is blended with you and when you're in true self. You know, and it's that idea of having enough true self available to be able to do the work, and unblending is a very instant way of creating enough self there to be able to view, to be able to understand, to be able to create dialogue with. So well, with that, I think we should probably explain to everybody a bit more about the basics of IFS. Sean, what do you reckon? I think it's probably
I think that's probably, we're assuming that people
know it, yeah.
IFS, you know, which so internal family systems, and was developed in the 1970s, 80s by a man called Richard Schwartz, who had trained in family therapy and become a family therapist, and so started to apply the principles of family therapy to working with clients, and came to recognize that people have internal, that's intrapsychic, within themselves, families of parts that relate to each other and can be in opposition to each other or blended with each other, might contradict each other, and so when the parts are kicking off or one is very dominant, it's very difficult to think as an overview and to have the parts working as a functional family, and this is what the work of Salvador Minuchin around structural family therapy, and Murray Bowen, Carl Whitaker, Virginia Satir. So we have to go back a little bit, sort of, because people like Virginia Satir, people like Salvador Minuchin began to appreciate that perhaps more can be gained from working with adolescents and other people, you know, older people, if we work with much more the family together. And so there was no training in family therapy. There was no books written, so they were kind of winging it, really. And Minuchin is the first person to sort of say this, is that, you know, we were sort of like just curious. We were really curious. If we bring the family together, what happens? And so different schools of family therapy emerged out of that. And family therapy was also influenced by the absolutely inspirational work of Gregory Bateson, who was an anthropologist, sociologist, philosopher, writer, poet. And he encouraged people to look for relationships where other people were seeing separate parts and elements. He looked for the relationship and how each part functioned with other parts. And so he was very much interested in something called systems theory. and something called cybernetics, which has been roughly described as the art of steerage. So if you set off in a direction to go to an island, if you do not alter the course subtly from left to right, and stay on the course you set off on, you'll probably miss the island that you're headed for. So we have to keep making adjustments, and that adjustments comes through feedback loops.
Okay, yeah.
So the feedback loop gives you feedback on your course, and we can make adjustments that way. And then we can have secondary feedback loops where we can have feedback on the feedback. So systems theory began to see the connections between things. And so when the family therapists started to work, they were working with these principles of cybernetics and systems theories, and at a place called, at Palo Alto, at the Mental Research Institute, the MRI Institute. And so people work with Gregory Bateson was there, a wonderful man called Jay Haley was there. Jay Haley had worked with Milton H. Erickson, who was a big influence upon solution-focused therapy. And and a lovely man with a wonderful name called Paul Waslowick. I don't know if you pronounce it like that, but it's written like that, Paul Waslowick, who wrote a seminal book on change.
It's a great name.
Yeah. And so people were beginning to appreciate that you can't just look at a person and just work with that one person. And the person's psyche isn't something that is separate from other people's psyche, and we're all like silos on legs walking around, but we interact with each other, and there's transactions that pass between us. So you can see that some of the words that I'm using, like transactions, was also being developed around the similar sorts of times, 50s, 60s, 70s, by Eric Berne in transactional analysis. So people were beginning to see, and in the same way that Berne talks about the ego states, we're beginning to see that it's perhaps more useful to think of the complexity of an individual rather than the simplicity.
Yeah, that makes absolute sense. Yeah.
So Schwartz, Richard Schwartz he had some understanding of the work of Salvador Minuchin, of Murray Bowen and Virginia Satir, although he was a little bit sort of critical of Virginia Satir to begin with, and thought that she was putting too much emphasis upon clear communication between one person and another. And she would actually stand between two people and hold the hand of one and hold the hand of the other and say, what would you like to say to this person, and what would you like to say to this person?
Wow. Okay.
And she would act as this bridge between the two.
That's incredible.
Oh, beautiful. I mean, she was...
That is incredible.
She was really quite an incredible person. And so they... So to begin with, it was applying the same principles to the issue that the person had. So it was like family therapy done with an individual. So it's working from a contextual understanding, but working with an individual. And then Richard Schwartz, to his credit, and with incredible dignity and humility, recognized that the clients themselves had a very different relationship with their parts and a very different understanding of it. And so it was actually his clients that helped him to see there are no bad parts. Even though I might be experiencing real struggles with some of the parts.
Yeah, I think there are unhelpful behaviours is probably a better way of looking at it, but not necessarily bad parts, given the repurposing and and that kind of stuff. Yeah, no, that's an interesting concept.
So he then sort of started to listen and asked, could you ask the part and talk to the part? What does the part? And actually, the parts became active participants, much more like family therapy would have done. So internal family therapy internal family systems. It's grew out of that. But that very rich period of the 1950s, where bringing into question the linear approach of cause and effect, and looking at there are perhaps multiple phenomena that are contributing to something that's happening rather than one cause and effect. Yeah, so, and then IFS thinks of them as managers, and the managers protect the parts that are very vulnerable, that have been humiliated, that have been shamed, and the main sort of like tenet of guiding principle of the managers is that the person will never be humiliated or shamed in that way again. So that's their purpose of protecting them. And the parts that are protected are in Richard Schwartz came to describe as exiles. So they get exiled out.
I understand that as almost like a fragment of the self that splits away and goes into hiding.
Yeah.
Because it's frightened and hurt and scared, quite frankly.
Yeah, it is. And when a person discovers that part, it's really, really moving, because they're often very small, crouched over in a darkened room, sometimes crying, sometimes sort of like non-verbal, and sort of burdened. And this is something that Schwartz says, that they are still burdened with the criticisms and shame that has been that they've been burdened with through the sort of expectations of others and being humiliated.
I remember getting in touch with one of my exiles who lived in a dark shack out in the middle of the woods on his own.
Right.
And he had these big, beautiful framed paintings on the wall.
Wow.
But all the paintings were black.
Oh.
The frames were all beautiful, but just the pictures inside were all black. And I said to him, "What do you want to do with these paintings?" He said, "I want to get rid of them." I said, "Okay, but I want to keep the frames." Okay, cool. So we took the paintings out of the frames and we burnt them. And we had a burn-in by the lake down in the forest. And then we went back to the shack, and the shack was all lit up. It was like it was come to life in some way.
Oh, how beautiful!
So somebody had like a dark shroud over it. So that was my experience of unburdening, and I had clients with very similar experiences, from the ridiculous to the profound and incredibly meaningful. It's all scales of the spectrum, and I think the point I want to make about that is this is how IFS is so personal. This is how it's so personal and so meaningful to everybody I've worked with it.
Yeah, and Richard Schwartz would encourage people to, in that process of unburden by returning to use of the elements with water or fire or earth and burying and and I think that's that reconnection again, isn't it, that we were talking about, wanting to reconnect people to the world, and this is something that connects with Gregory Bateson's work in terms of the ecology, the ecology of being, the ecology of mind, and the work of Nora Bates and his daughter, who made a wonderful film, The Ecology of Mind, which was about her relationship with her father, and it's so there are the protectors that protect the exiled part that lives in the cabin, that has felt they've needed to do that, surrounded by these paintings. And then there's the parts that you've talked about, which is the firefighters. That because a system always wants to maintain a status quo and homeostasis, and so it'll try to, but sometimes that homeostasis can't be maintained, and the if a person connects very sort of immediately and very viscerally with the sense of what the exile is still carrying, then that can burst out into their life, and then the protector is, the protection that the protector has afforded is temporarily lost, or for some time can be lost, and the person then engages in what could potentially be thought of, although it's not, self-destructive behavior. It's simply a way of managing the shame and what's been burdened, how it's escaped. So they would then, Schwartz would refer to that as firefighters. So, like getting drunk and gambling and having
generally most addictive behaviours fall in firefighting, and I don't know whether I'd put like procrastination in as like a firefighting behaviour or not, because it's almost like procrastination is a whole part on itself. And I loved your description of your procrastinator as being like a big blob of jelly, whereas that one always kind of stuck with me. I experienced my procrastinator to be a bit more like Mr. Messy from the Mr. Men. He's like this big ball of string that just extends and wraps around everything and just holds it all together and doesn't let it go. That's kind of how I experienced my procrastinator. It's quite interesting, isn't it, when you look at how we all have these same parts but in different experiences.
Yeah, people talk about it as a self-saboteur sometimes, don't they? But I don't think I've never experienced it like that, actually. People have referred to me as self-sabotage. What I'm doing is self-sabotage at times, sort of in my past. And if only you were more organised, then you'd get a lot more done. But I think
How many times have I heard that in my life?
That was the reason for the procrastinator, was because there was at one time in my life, it was a genuine fear that if I did things, I'd get into trouble. I would draw attention to myself, and I'd either be humiliated, ridiculed, or told that I'd done something wrong, and I'd made something visible which shouldn't be made visible. And so to procrastinate makes absolute sense. It protects me. You don't want to be doing that. You don't want to finish that work. You don't want to finish that course that you've started. You don't want to graduate. You don't want to you don't want to have that exhibition. You don't want to sort of perform that play. You don't want to finish that piece of choreography.
How many artists are held back by releasing their work by procrastination, for fear of judgment, for fear of maybe even, I've heard some artists say, well, what if people actually like it? Worry. And I think that so many people produce incredible work that never gets released because the procrastinator comes in as a protector. Because at some point in their past, their work has been criticised, they've had negative feedback, and that fear creeps in.
So what we're dealing with metaphors to explain complex processes that are so personal to each individual. And what I have found is that with some encouragement as to ask the simple questions from clean language, what's that like, and is there anything else about that, and what happens then, and what happens just before, and where, if a person describes it as a feeling, sort of where's that feeling located, and what would you like to have done about that, are really respectful questions. So that's another set of metaphors. And it seems to be around facilitating a conversation which is much more respectful, which is much more helpful, which immediately starts to work with how the client makes sense of it, I was doing a goldfish bowl with some students the other day, and I said, and that such and such is like what? And the person sat opposite me was able to say. And then another student said, yeah, but what happens if the person says, I don't know? So if we ask a person sort of that part that you're describing is like what? And they say, well, I don't know, it's just a part. Then we go with it's just a part, and you don't know. And that not knowing is like what? And they smiled like you're smiling now because they realized that, oh yeah, of course. It really is so simple, and we complicate things so much in therapy, in psychology, in spirituality. I think we just complicate things when it's so much more simple.
Of course, what you're doing with that protector in that moment by doing that is saying, "Come here. It's okay. Come here.
Yeah.
Come on. We can have a chat. It's fine.
Yeah.
I'm not going to harm you. I don't mean any harm to anybody.
Yeah.
Just want to have a chat."
Yeah, but we have to win the trust of that part.
Yeah.
And sometimes the person will say, I don't know, it's not, when I ask, what could you ask the protector how old it thinks you are? And they say, I've no idea. And I say, well, no, I appreciate you have no idea what the protector is thinking. I think if we just wait for a moment, maybe, and there's nothing coming back, then I then say, well, maybe, the protector needs to feel safe enough with me in order to sort of share some of its experiences and some of knowing that all the time it's a part of the client. So it's a very direct way of calibrating the quality of trust that we've been able to establish. And if I can work with nothing. A colleague of mine, that's what she said about me. She said that what I really respect about you is that you make something out of nothing. You just work with nothing. If there's nothing there, then there is something there because it's being described as nothing. There's the state of nothingness, and so that's really exciting. So yeah, I found it very helpful way of working. So yes, there's the broken down into there's the observing self or the self, and then there are different parts. And if we can encourage a person to have an experience of the self, they can see how qualitatively different it is in experience from being in a part. And certainly it's been really helpful for people to just think that rather than that one part that's dominant at any particular time, that's figural, is the whole of them, that it's a part of them. So,
yes,
that's really helpful.
I always tell clients when I'm introducing IFS to them, I always tell them to go and watch a Disney film, which is Inside Out, which it has to be one of my favourite Disney films. I love whoever wrote that, came up with that. Take my hat off to them because it's IFS for children. It's a brilliant way of kids to understand how their emotions work in their heads, and it's so visual and so brilliantly done. It's just genius. And they'll always come back and go, oh, when you said internal family systems, I thought it was going to be really complicated, but that made a lot of sense to me. And I go, right, okay, now we can go, because now you get an understanding of how it works, because you see it in operation. You actually see anger take the controls from joy. You see, is it sadness? One of the other ones come in, and you see all these different parts, and you see the relationships between them as well. Yeah. It's so fascinating to think of the simplicity of therapy in that way. Do you know what I mean? This is the thing that drew me to this. It's so simple.
Yeah, it is so simple, and I think and that for me is its essence. Because yes, you can get complicated, and yes, you can talk about specific types of protectors and that are typical across different people, but they're all going to be so unique to the person. So the less I know, the better. And so working with the idea that a person isn't just one person, doesn't have a self, but is always in process, is always in the state of becoming, and has multiple selves, and those selves are useful at different times with different people in certain contexts, and that all of the selves, even though it might not be experienced at the time of meeting by the client that they're there to help them, to aid them, to protect them, are there to protect them. And my role is just to help the person get to know those selves, get to know themselves in the selves, plural, and be able to have a conversation with them, you know, a bit like we're having now. And so it's a bit like when I'm working with people around making drawings and images and things like that. It's mark making. So you put one line down, and then it's the relationship between that line and the next line which determines, and eventually you've got an ear, and you've eventually got, you know, in relationship to the eye, in relationship to the nose and the head and the body. And you know, before long you've drawn this complex image of a person, but it's emerged out of paying respect to each part of the process, each relationship.
I think that's a big word as well, isn't it? Is the respect. Is the respect in the relationships that are there.
Yeah.
Because I think one of the biggest misconceptions about IFS when I explain it to clients is that they think that you have to get to know this protector and then in some way we're going to get rid of it. And it's quite an easy thing to think when you think of change is we're going to change that part. Well, that part's not very helpful. Let's get rid of it. That's not actually what happens, is it? You know, what we end up doing is unburdening an exile, and then we have a protector which is performing a behaviour which is unhelpful to the self, and it's performing a behaviour on a historic basis which it no longer needs to perform because there's no pain there for it to protect anymore. So what we then do is to repurpose, isn't it? Is to give the protector a new job. And again, I think it's this idea of dialogue with the parts that goes all the way through this method of therapy, which is so powerful. And it's the having the dialogue between yourself and the protector, and what would you like to do? What are your skills? What can you do for me? You know, and I think that's such an amazing way of looking at it. When I experienced this with my therapist the first time, I was almost overwhelmed with the feeling that came up from asking my sergeant major part, who was like General Melchett from Blackadder, you know, he was my caretaker, and I didn't get to know. He was one of the last ones I got to know properly because he was so like hidden away in the shadows. You know, he's a wily bugger to get to know. And the conversation I had with him when I was like, well, what do you want to do? You know, and he was like, my God, you're asking me. You know, and it was that feeling of joy that I felt in my whole body. That feeling of joy at him just feeling that somebody was curious enough to ask him that question.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah.
And that was the moment my relationship with him completely changed.
Yeah.
Completely.
Yeah. And that's to me that's sort of really important, is to help the person have a much more contemporary relationship with themselves. When we're talking about these parts, they are part of the person, and so recruiting the part and you know, giving it a different job description and asking, would it be willing to work with us? You know, what does the part need for it to trust us in this, that the person has, since the part's inception, had lots of different experiences, and so now they would like to be able to talk in public. They would like to be able to sort of form a relationship. They would like to write a book. They would like to paint something. They would like to sort of be relating differently to their children or something like that. Then you know, sort of like, what do you need? What needs to happen for you to sort of build that trust? And then once that's been established and seen that there has been that learning that's happened since its inception, it's, well, will you join us? Will you bring that sense of protection and commitment to and perhaps have this role and step in if you think that we have are heading towards, can you give us a warning rather than disabling the person's capacity to function?
Yeah, because I think our protectors have an inbuilt worry that they're going to get left behind. That if they don't have a purpose anymore. Keep coming to that phrase lately, a sense of purpose. It just keeps popping up everywhere in conversations I'm having left, right and centre. It's fascinating me. But it is for protectors, it is continuing with a sense of purpose. And for the self, I think it's important for the self to know that the protectors that are being repurposed want to do what they want to do. The self wants to know that all the rest of the parts are happy.
Yeah.
It's quite interesting the way the whole system supports itself and looks after itself, and it's just incredible to look at it in that way.
Yeah, it's a really useful metaphor that helps the person build a better relationship with those parts than the knee-jerk reactions and the learnt responses, the shutting down, humiliation, sort of blame, and that disables a person and sort of holds them back when actually they really want to write that book, or they want to apply for that job, or they want to start a relationship or something like that, or go to a party. And I think it has so many sort of, this is what therapy has been pointing to. Look at Rogers and the sort of organismic valuing process, that the organism knows what it wants. And that's what I think he means when, the client is the expert. Well, that expertise is there, but the person may be disconnected from their expertise. And the expertise is what we were talking about earlier in terms of returning to the environment, the ecology that is, because if I'm taken out of that context and I'm abstracted from that relationship, that sensory relationship, that feedback loop, and I don't trust my body and I don't trust the sort of sensations, and I feel threatened by my own emotions, or I'm kind of traumatized and hounded by my own thoughts, then all those are representations of how I've become estranged from myself. I've become separated from myself. And of course, when that happens, the self and these parts are thought as alien. They're thought as not part of me, and potentially threatening. And the early attempts to regain control over them and say don't listen to them and just ignore them and do another activity proved to be sort of really unhelpful.
Yeah, I mean some of the protectors can be quite difficult to reach at times. I mentioned just now the caretaker was particularly wily. I mentioned about the exile in the woods just now. That was protected by a protector who was a bear, who I experienced to be a bear. He was a big, towering, angry claws and teeth, and and turns out all he wanted to do was to be fed. He wanted some food. So I pinned a note to my fridge that just said "feed the bear." That was there, and the other people in the house with me at the time had no clue what the hell was going on in my head, but to me that meant something, because every morning when I go to the fridge to get my milk to make my coffee, I'd see "feed the bear," and then I'd know when I went to do my morning meditation, I would sit and I would call the bear up, and I'd take him some salmon, because bears love salmon, I'd take him some salmon, and then after a while of doing that, he figured out that I could be trusted. That if I wanted to help him, then I obviously wanted to help the exiled part. So he let me access into the woods then. And it just goes to show it can be a time-consuming process, and it can be quite a tricky road to navigate. But at the end of the day, what you get back is so worthwhile, And you go. It's always worth remembering in mind. I always say to clients that if there's something that's difficult to get in touch with, that's probably because it's been hidden for a long time. And it's been hidden for a long time and hasn't had any connection with the outside world, so therefore its perception of the outside world is that it is not safe at all. So it is going to take a little time to build this relationship up, you know.
Yes, if you think of how long psychotherapy is expected to take, if you think of how long...
What is the expectation on that from
counselling
textbooks?
is expected? Well, psychotherapy can run into years.
Yeah.
You know, and it's an open-ended, it doesn't have to be, it can be contracted. There are no sort of like, you know, absolutes, but the idea that, you know, psychotherapy may well be of a longer term than counselling. But even counselling is, you know, even if it's 6 sessions, you know, that's 6 hours a week apart, so that's over 6 weeks. And if you think of how quickly life can change in a matter of seconds in a sort of traumatic situation, and have lasting repercussions. So I think that it's developing the relationship with the parts takes commitment, and I think that it's enabling a person to know how they are committed to that part, and where their commitment is. And it's a bit like people saying they have no motivation. Well, everybody has motivation. It just might not be motivation to revise. It might not be motivation to sort of apply for a job. It might not be motivation to sort of fix the house or something. But they're so motivated when it comes to watching Netflix, or when it comes to watching YouTube, or when it comes to sort of like, you know,
playing the PlayStation, or, you know,
something like that. But so it's not that they can't prioritize. It's just that they're prioritizing other things. So procrastination, you can look at it as procrastination, or you can look at it as a prioritizing other things. So, but then taking that capacity to prioritize, that commitment that's already there, and making that commitment to this part of themselves and building that relationship. I think it takes time, but it's not necessarily, you know, when you look at the time that's just a given or expected with other forms of therapy.
Yes, there is a time frame which is expected, and I always find that the concept of tying it down to 6 or 8 sessions, or saying I only want to work for this long, I find that quite unusual. But of course we do live in quite a fast-paced society where everybody wants the quick fix, everybody wants the, you know, the sticky plaster, I suppose, you know.
And that's again, you know, back to the old sort of issue that where everything has been reduced down to its parts and not seen as how it's connected to part of a system. So out of the work of Virginia Satir and Milton H. Erickson and other people, Richard Bandler and John Grinder, who developed something called neuro-linguistic programming.
Yes,
Yeah,
that's quite a popular thing these days as well, isn't it? NLP.
Yeah.
A lot more people training in NLP.
Yeah, and they because it has this systemic viewpoint, you know, and it makes use of something called utilization, which is, you know, Milton Erickson's. He would use anything. So, like I said earlier, if the client says, "I don't know," it's like nothing. Use the nothing. Make the nothing the thing. But they would do something called the ecological check, and so you have to look at this action that is being taken, or you're thinking of taking. What effect will it have upon the other parts? What effect do we have any sort of opposition from other parts? Because that's the other thing Schwartz was able to see, that parts become polarized. So they become they kind of like disagree with each other. And as the person gets to know the parts, then they can introduce them. Sometimes parts don't even know that other parts exist. You know, it's like they think they're the only part.
Yeah, absolutely.
You know, like Catholics in heaven. They just think that they're the only people there. Those are the Catholics. Don't let them know. And so it's kind of, it's a returning to in narrative therapy. There's a called like remembering. helping to bring the person back into communities of care and love, and become, a member once again. And I think that's what happens in internal family systems. So it's a metaphor.
I've often described it as like your computer operating system. So you've got your operating system, and then you've got apps as well. And it's almost like some of your protectors are apps that haven't been updated since childhood, and they're due an update.
Yeah.
Because that's basically what your computer system does, doesn't it? It brings out an update. There's a rewiring of the software for the app, and then the app performs better or differently, however it wants to. And I think that's quite an interesting way of looking at IFS. Is you've got an app that needs an update there. It's doing something it doesn't need to do, and there's actually a better way for that app to work now.
And something people can find immediately helpful is that, like I said, with the piece of paper, but just simply sometimes it can be just as effective to ask the thought, to ask the sensation, to ask the feeling, can you just step back a little? Can I just have some time out? Can I just have a little bit of space? And and that little bit of space and the experience a person can have when I don't have to analyze it, I don't have to see where it's come from in my childhood or anything like that. Was I ever locked in a cupboard? No. Well, yes, but we won't go into that. But it's kind of
my brain went Harry Potter then. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
You weren't brought up by the Dursleys, were you?
Well, it was. I'm sure my mother was sort of like a true blood, and I'm just a little muggle, but it's like, you don't have to go into all those parts to analyze them and find out where they were origin. You can just say, can you just step back a moment?
Yeah.
And developing that capacity to say, okay, come, what is it that you need? Can I now just have a little bit of space? Can you wait a moment, because I'm talking to this part here.
Yeah.
I really want to hear what you've got to say, but I'm in a conversation with this part. And then when that's reached some kind of, you've gathered some meaning from that, it's important to return to this part here and say, okay, I'm sorry that I had to ask you to wait. What is it that you'd like to say? Then you're reparenting your parts. You're being that good enough mother like Winnicott.
A really good example, I think, to share of this is from this morning. So, like I said to you this morning, I didn't get in from work I didn't finish work till 2, so it was 3 before I gone to bed. I'm kind of, takes me a while to settle down, and then, I was kind of awake about 7:30, naturally, as the body clock goes, hi, So I've only had about 4 hours sleep, and no Alan today, so I had a little bit more to do setting up that I wasn't expecting to do. So I've gone to take my partner to work, and I'm in the car on the way back, and I'm like, right, Sergeant Major, I'm going to need you this morning, mate. We need to set the podcast studio up, and I need to do it without thinking. So if you could just come and help me, please, I would really, really appreciate it. And at the same time, if you could shut anxiety up for a little bit, because he's really starting to piss me off this morning. I just don't need his voice in, so if you could just tell him to go away for a little bit, I'd really appreciate that too. And then, come in, and you've rocked up here at, beautifully on time, as you always do, and I'm pretty much set up, ready to go. And without that, Sergeant Major, I need you this morning, without that connection that I have with him, I probably would have still been setting this up now, because the ADHD brain would have got involved. I would have been scattered. I would have been doing 35 different things at once and achieving nothing, and we probably wouldn't have sat down to record anything yet. So it's quite amazing when you think of, that for me was a massive journey in repurposing him. He was really tricky, because being a caretaker, he's got the strings attached to other parts that he can pull, and if you try and have a chat with him, he pulls a string and distracts you off over there somewhere, and they're real wily ones to get in touch with. But now we're mates. He's invaluable. I could not have started my private practice without him. I couldn't, on both counts, you know, the one I had in Cheltenham and the one I've got now. I could not have set up this podcast without him. You know, there's so many things I wouldn't be able to do without having him on board. You know, it's an incredible way to look at it all, isn't it, when you realise?
It sounds like it's been a really helpful metaphor for you to sort of open those dialogues with these parts.
I don't know if that is just because of the ADHD, whether it just makes sense to me. I don't know. But whatever, yeah, you're absolutely right. It's been super powerful for me and continues to be. You know?
Yeah. I kind of think the ADHD is what the raw process looks like. That's what it feels to me. It feels like the raw process of Thomas Fuchs talks about the brain as being a sort of integrating organism.
Okay. Yeah.
Right. So it integrates sort of sensation from the body. It integrates from the outside. It reaches out and it makes contact with and receives that which is sort of, you know, the world that's out there. So it integrates it all. But imagine being able to see that process as it's happening, and the raw data. So I think it's a bit like that. It's you know, another thing that really interests me is photography. So on my mobile phone now, I can save an image in RAW, or I can save it as a JPEG, and the JPEG the phone has made decisions for me. It's taken out some of the pixels, it's blended some of the colors, and it's kind of like simplified the shapes and everything. And the RAW is just everything. It's none of that process has been applied. There's no filters, there's no enhancement or anything. And so the JPEG is like, for, you know, most people think in JPEGs. They think
I love that. Most people think in JPEGs.
Most people think in
That's
JPEGs.
Brilliant.
Well, they do.
Brilliant.
They go around and they've got these enhancements.
I want that to be the title of this episode.
Yeah, because the saturation has been increased. The sort of the sort of, you know, sharpening on certain things, and it's also easier. They're not as the file isn't as big, and so the raw file takes a little bit more work, but it just has so much more. And I think a person living with ADHD has almost like direct access to all of that.
Yeah. I hit on this with Sue in that podcast as well, about how ADHD people experience the world to be so much more information rich. Yeah. You know, there is more available to you, and yeah, it just blows my mind thinking about it in this way. Do you know what I mean? It really does.
Yeah.
Because for such a long time, when I was thinking about, you know, is the ADHD label for me? Do I fit in with that? Is it something I want to kind of make sense of, or, you know? And at the start of that process, there's an idea that ADHD is in some way a debilitation, but actually now I'm starting to see it as more of a gift. You know, it gives me the ability to process things faster than other people. It gives me the ability to brain spot through things, so I can pull several concepts together at once and take a line straight through the middle. It gives me the ability to have greater clarity and understanding on a subject. You know? So I'm now seeing it as much more of a gift, and that's been a journey in discovering that, you know. Yeah. It's interesting.
I think it is. I'm just hoping that the rest of the world sort of finds it. That's it. Finds a way back to the raw files, and being able to cope with the information, the sensory information that's available in a raw file.
That's a word,
that
isn't it?
doesn't immediately look that good. You know, you need to take a raw file, you need to put it into Lightroom, and you need to sort of like work with it on the curves and, you know, the sort of exposure and the blacks and the whites and color and saturation and stuff like that. It needs work, you know. So it's not easy living with ADHD, and that's why I think a lot of people would be, you know, kind of would say, no, it's not a gift. It's actually sort of, but the reason it's not a gift is because we're expected to live in a world that demands JPEGs. They demand quick answers. Come on, you know, you like it or you don't like it. You know, what is it about? What are you thinking? What are you feeling? And we haven't got time for that now. We've got to go to this. And you've started something and there's only 5 minutes, you know. Yeah, but until I'm at that 5th minute, I've still got time, you know. So my ADHD is that I don't have any sense of time.
Me either.
And everything is of equal importance, you know, and I'm I'm fascinated by the patterns and that I see all around me. So, yeah, I think at best, my work as a therapist is to help people appreciate the bigger picture and to see how the JPEG, that you know, has lost some of its appeal, actually sort of like, well, we've still got the raw file, we can return to the raw file, and you can actually experience much more of the detail and the color and the light, and see things that have just been, the filter has removed from the JPEG.
It's a beautiful way of looking at it. It really is, but yeah, it just makes so much sense to me. It really does.
You could call it Lightroom therapy, couldn't you?
Lightroom therapy.
You know, it's kind of, that's a
great title for a book. I like that. Lightroom therapy. Yeah, so, I think as well, there's the other thing about looking at images on a phone and kind of editing them on a phone with something like Lightroom or, you know, something like that, is you've always got an undo button. You know, so if you do something to the photo and you don't like what it looks like, you can just undo, and you can undo by each step. So it's like you take 2 steps forward. Well, you can take 2 steps back if you don't like what's happened. You can go forward, you can go back.
And the same in therapy. You can move towards that which you've put on a piece of paper over the other side of the room, or you can move away from it. And you can re-experience it. You know, you can step into it, but because you know you can step out of it. And I love that facility in Lightroom where you just, on the phone anyway, with a touch screen, you press it and it shows you what your starting point. And wouldn't it be great if we could just press and go back to being that sort of starting point of mystery and awe? For me, that's why myth and stories and your bear and the cabin and the black paintings,
all the narrative, Sean,
so
all
beautiful.
Of the narrative is just incredible, isn't it?
Yeah, we're storytellers, really, aren't we?
110%.
Yeah.
I think somebody asked me a couple of weeks ago, somebody I was having a chat with, what's the biggest thing that you've struggled with in life, Rich? And I had to think about it for a minute, and the answer is being different. That's been my biggest struggle in life. It's not been getting over the traumas. It's not been getting to know myself or any of the parts. It's been coming to terms with the fact that I am different and that is okay. I don't have to fit into the JPEG world because I'm not a JPEG.
No.
You know?
No.
I maybe still not sure what I am in terms of a photograph, but definitely not a JPEG.
No.
And that's okay.
Yeah.
You know, that is absolutely okay.
Yeah.
I think that it's really interesting, and a big part of that being okay was I keep coming back to it, was you making me wash a cow.
Yeah.
Because that was when I stopped caring about what anybody else thought about and stepped into who I am.
Yeah.
You know, and was able to just do that without any care of judgment or whatever, you know.
Yeah. But the world encourages us to see the world and ourselves as JPEGs and turn life into a GIF or a GIF, you know.
You know what they are? You know what JPEGs and GIFs and all that, you know what they are? they're compressed files.
Yeah.
They're actually they're a compression
Under pressure.
Yeah, so that's why I'm doing that. Under pressure, they're a compression of a file.
And that's what happens to us.
Yeah.
So the hardest thing I've had to deal with is school. I think I'd just go straight to that. It was school, which is intended as a preparation for life.
Well, you talk about a fitting in experience. School is your first fitting in experience.
And an education and a broadening of a mind.
Yeah.
No, not for me. It was. I came in as this bouncing raw file, and just got more and more compressed. Down into the way out was art for me, and then later theatre and dance, and then
was for me, but
counselling and psychotherapy.
For me, it was music. For me, it was DJing. That was where I found myself.
Beautiful.
Yeah, that was where I found myself. Yeah, it's weird, isn't it? How art seems to be that catalyst for change for so many people. It's the thing that breaks them out.
Well, art is. I can't remember who said it, but art is a verb. It's not a noun. And that's what art reminds me of. And at its best, therapy is art. Because it returns us to. So going back to what I said right at the very beginning, when I'm about to start painting again.
Oh, fantastic!
And I
look forward to seeing.
Yeah, and I'm going to take Fridays out. I'm no longer teaching on Fridays, so I'll have Fridays for painting and I'll have Fridays for writing.
Nice.
And what I write, and the poems that I write, or the verse that I write, I want people to say, "Is this really a poem?" And to the paintings, is this art? That's a success for me. So when people say, is this therapy? What therapy is this? What kind of therapy is this? It's kind of it's raw therapy.
When you think about the word therapy, I mean, the word therapy, in its basic sense, means to elicit change, to heal. To heal.
Yeah.
It's a. I can't remember the direct definition of it now. I've got it written down somewhere because I put it on my website. But essentially, it is to change in a healing way, is to recover the self from a place of unwholeness.
Yeah.
I think. Yeah, and if you look at that, and if you take that concept on its own, it stands to reason that is going to be so individual for every single person. Which is why the idea of prescribed therapy is so alien to me. You have to fit into this CBT model. You have to fit into this solution focus model.
They're all metaphors.
Yeah.
You see them all as metaphors. For me, that's the red thread that connects them all. It's Ariadne's thread out of the labyrinth of materialism that we've created for ourselves. Everybody thinks of Daedalus as being this incredible mythological kind of creator of fantastic things and the labyrinth, but that's what Western society has done. It's we're wandering round this hopeless labyrinth, looking for ways out into the fields again.
Yeah, but the way out is through the inside. Is it not? The way out is through the connection with self. As far as I can work out, I'm not claiming to have got it right, but this is just my thinkings on it, is that, the way out is through finding yourself, which is I'm going to add that to the list of backward things, because it's not how life should work, to my mind. It's one of those things, how's the way out through the inside? That's ridiculous. But actually it is. That's where you find connection with the earth, with other people, with yourself, with all of that is through that inner experience. And society constantly encourages us to find our answers from out there, not in here, which is why so much of the work we do with clients is on bringing that locus of evaluation onto the inside, and you know as well as I do, that is a pivotal point of change for any client, whether you're working with a coach or a counsellor or a psychotherapist or whatever. The moment of change is all hinged around that movement of the locus of evaluation. It's so important.
And it for me, it's feeling for the red thread. Because
I like the way you said that. feeling for it,
Yeah.
not looking for it,
No,
not
feel
trying
for
to
it.
find it. You feel for it.
Yeah, because we can't see into the unconscious. We can only feel into the unconscious, and to feel our way forward, through and out, and back, back to that connection. Great. Okay.
Awesome. That's weird because I just looked at the clock to see how long we've done, and we're on 1:29. So it's kind of weird. These podcasts seem to take an hour and a half quite naturally, Sean.
Well, there you
seems
go.
to be lovely. Thank you very much for joining me today. This has been
Yeah.
an amazing conversation, and as
You're
always,
welcome. And maybe we should mention the two books that we
yes.
both have here
We did, yeah.
that are Internal Family Systems, second edition by Richard Schwartz and Martha Sweezy.
And this one, which is the Bible that I use, that you introduced me to, is Self Therapy, which is by Jay Earley. Just to say very quickly, it's not that these two ways of working from these books are radically different.
No.
They're not at all.
No.
They're just slight differentiations on the same ideas. I mean, it's Richard Schwartz who came up with the idea. I'm a particular fan of Jay Earley's work because I love the way that he's done that and turned it into something you can apply to yourself.
Me too.
Which goes back to this idea we touched on last time of, not all therapy needs to be done in the therapy room. There's a fantastic amount of understanding and knowledge that people can gain about themselves by reading books like this, by listening to podcasts like this,
or working on their allotment.
by working on their allotment. Exactly that.
I just think that's there's so much that is healed in working on allotment, growing roses, picking fruit, and sitting down.
My most popular viewed short on YouTube by a long shot, and I mean by a long shot, is it was taken from the First Street interviews we did in Bristol, and I put it up as a daft thing because it made me smile when the guy said it, and I thought it was so beautiful. But we said to him, what's one tip that you would say to give to people to manage their mental health? And he comes out and he says, get a plant.
Yeah.
Just get a plant. Just simple as that. And I was like, that's really interesting. What makes you say that? He went, something to care for, isn't it? And it was just that, poof, it's simple, and it's back to that, if you've got something to nurture, to care for, that is a focus away from you, aside from yourself, from your problems, from whatever you've got to deal with, if you've got to focus on making that thing live, then that does something really powerful on the inside of you. That gives you a connection,
absolutely,
to growth, to life. It's wild, isn't it?
Wild is the word.
Wild is the word. Okay, on that note, let's
thank you.
Let's finish it up there. Thank you very much, Sean. We'll see you again soon.
An absolute pleasure. Thank you.
Cheers.